In the summer of 1260, the greatest army of conquest the world had ever known marched toward Egypt, convinced that no force on earth could stop it. For 40 years, the Mongols had crushed empires, burned cities, and erased entire civilizations from the map. Baghdad had fallen, Damascus had fallen, and now the hordes from the east advanced toward Cairo, certain that the last bastion of Islam would kneel before them like all the others. But in a dusty valley of Galilee, near a spring the ancients called Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, something different awaited them. It was not fear, it was not surrender. It was an army of slaves turned warriors, men who had been torn from their homes in the steppes, sold in the markets of Damascus and Cairo, trained to kill from the moment they could hold a sword. And at their head, a sultan who had sworn to die before bowing to the Mongols. Then came the dawn of September 3rd, and the valley erupted in fire. Arrows darkened the sky, horse hooves thundered like rolling storms. Steel clashed against steel. The screams of the dying mingled with the roars of war, and, in the midst of the chaos, something impossible began to happen. The Mongols, the invincible, the unbeatable, started to retreat. When the dust finally settled over Ain Jalut, the world had changed forever. For the first time in history, the Mongol advance had been stopped. Not temporarily, not by a storm or a disease, but by the sword and the will of men who chose to fight rather than die on their knees. And the echo of that battle would resound through the centuries, an eternal reminder that even the most powerful empires can meet their end in the least expected place. To understand what happened at Ain Jalut, one must first understand the absolute terror that the Mongols had sown across the known world. Since Genghis Khan unified the tribes of the steppes in the early 13th century, his people had conquered more territory in 50 years than the Roman Empire had in 500. They had ravaged China. They had destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire. They had reached Poland and Hungary, leaving a trail of charred cities and millions of dead in their wake. In 1258, 2 years before Ain Jalut, Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulagu Khan, had committed one of the most devastating acts in human history. With an army of more than 130,000 men, he had besieged Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, the city of 1,001 nights, the center of knowledge and culture for 500 years. Caliph al-Mustasim, arrogant and confident, had refused to surrender. What followed was a nightmare the world would never forget. For an entire week, the Mongols sacked the city, the streets filled with corpses. Blood ran through the canals until the Tigris turned red. Libraries containing centuries of knowledge were thrown into the river, and according to the chronicles, the water turned black with the ink of destroyed books. The most conservative estimates speak of 200,000 dead. Some sources say it was 1 million. The Caliph himself was captured and executed in a manner the Mongols considered a macabre honor. They wrapped him in a carpet and trampled him with horses so that his royal blood would not touch the earth. With his death, the Abbasid Caliphate ended, the religious and political authority that had governed the heart of the Muslim world for 5 centuries. After Baghdad, Hulagu advanced into Syria. Aleppo fell. Damascus surrendered without a fight, opening its gates to the conquerors. The Mongols reached the shores of the Mediterranean, and then Hulagu sent messengers to Egypt with an ultimatum for the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz: surrender or suffer the same fate as Baghdad. The letter was a masterpiece of psychological terror. It described in detail the atrocities committed, the cities destroyed, the kings murdered. It reminded Qutuz that no army had ever defeated the Mongols in pitched battle. It warned him that resistance would only prolong the inevitable suffering. Qutuz read the letter in silence. Then he ordered the messengers beheaded and their heads hung on the gates of Bab Zuwayla, the main entrance to Cairo. It was a declaration of war. It was a challenge to destiny, and it was the beginning of one of the most audacious military campaigns in history. Saif al-Din Qutuz had not been born a slave. He had been born a prince. As a child, he was Mahmud ibn Mamdud, a descendant of the Khwarezmian dynasty, one of the great empires of Central Asia. But when the Mongols ravaged Khwarezm in 1231, the young prince was captured, sold into slavery, and taken to Damascus. From there, he passed to Egypt, where he was purchased by the Mamluk Sultan Aybak. The Mamluks were a walking paradox, slaves who had become the most feared warriors of the Muslim world, and eventually its rulers. Recruited mainly from the Turkic and Kipchak tribes of the steppes of southern Russia, they were trained from childhood in the art of war. They learned to ride before they could walk, to shoot a bow at full gallop, to fight with saber, lance, and mace. And when they completed their training, they were freed, though their loyalty to the Sultan, who had purchased them, lasted a lifetime. Qutuz proved to be extraordinary even among the Mamluks. He rose quickly through the ranks, earning the respect of his peers and the favor of his masters. He became vice-sultan, the power behind the throne for more than 20 years. And when the Mongol threat became imminent, when it became clear that the teenage Sultan Al-Mansur Ali could not lead Egypt in its darkest hour, Qutuz did what had to be done. In November of 1259, he deposed the young sultan and took the throne for himself. He was not seeking personal glory. He was seeking the survival of his people. He promised the emirs that they could choose another sultan after they defeated the Mongols. But first, they had to defeat them. At his side was an equally formidable man, Baybars al-Bundukdari, a blue-eyed Kipchak warrior who had been sold into slavery in his youth. Baybars was brilliant, ambitious, and lethal. He had led the Mamluks against the Seventh Crusade, capturing King Louis IX of France himself. He knew the terrain of Palestine like the palm of his hand, for he had wandered those lands as a fugitive before reconciling with Qutuz. Together, the Sultan and the general began preparing the defense of Egypt. But Qutuz knew that waiting behind the walls of Cairo would be suicide. The Mongols were masters of siege warfare. They had taken cities believed to be impregnable. If they were to have any chance, they would have to strike first. And then came the news that would change everything. Munkar Khan, the great Khan of the Mongols, had died in China while fighting against the Song dynasty. His death triggered a succession crisis that would shake the empire. Hulagu, who had planned to continue his campaign against Egypt, was forced to return to Mongolia with most of his army to participate in the council that would elect the new Great Khan. He left behind only a fraction of his forces, approximately 10,000 warriors under the command of his most trusted general, Kitbuka Noyan. It was still a formidable army, but vulnerable, and Qutuz knew it. Kitbuka was a legendary warrior in his own right. He belonged to the Naimans, a Turkic tribe that had been absorbed into the Mongol Empire. He was a Nestorian Christian, one of many Christians who served the Mongol Khans, and had participated in all of Hulagu's great conquests: the destruction of the Nizari assassins, the sack of Baghdad, the taking of Damascus. He was a man of unshakable honor, fiercely loyal to his lord, and absolutely convinced of Mongol invincibility. He had seen his people defeat armies 10 times larger. He had seen cities believed to be eternal reduced to ashes. To him, the Mamluks of Egypt would be just another victim in the unstoppable march of the horde. While waiting for reinforcements that would never arrive, Kitbuka kept his army busy. He sacked Sidon in Lebanon. He consolidated Mongol control over Syria. And when news reached him that a Mamluk army had departed from Cairo, he did not hesitate. He marched south to confront them, confident that the tactical superiority of his warriors would compensate for any numerical disadvantage. What he did not know was that Qutuz had achieved something that seemed impossible. He had negotiated safe passage through Crusader territory. The remaining Crusaders in the Holy Land, concentrated mainly in Acre, had been courted by both the Mongols and the Mamluks. Hulagu had proposed an alliance, and some Christian lords, such as the Armenian king Hetumanan, the Prince of Antioch, had accepted, even participating in the sack of Baghdad. But Pope Alexander IV had forbidden any formal pact with the pagan Mongols. When Qutuz requested permission to cross Crusader territory with his army, the barons of Acre made a pragmatic decision. The Mongols were the greater threat. They allowed the Mamluks to pass and even sold them supplies when they camped near the city to resupply. On July 26, 1260, the Mamluk army departed from Cairo. They marched through the Sinai, crossed Gaza, advanced along the coastal plain of Palestine. They were approximately 20,000. Men, heavy Mamluk cavalry, horse archers, support infantry. It was not a huge army by the standards of the time, but every soldier was a warrior trained from childhood for a single purpose. Baybars commanded the vanguard. He was the perfect scout. He knew the terrain, he knew the enemy, and he knew the tactics that had made them invincible. Because Baybars had studied the Mongols with the obsession of a man who knows his life, depends on understanding them. The Mongols won their battles through a lethal combination of mobility, discipline, and deception. Their favorite tactic was the feigned retreat, appearing to flee in disorder to draw the enemy into a reckless pursuit, then suddenly turning to destroy them. They had used this trick again and again in China, in Persia, in the Russian steppes, in Poland. Their opponents fell into the trap because they could not believe that the feared Mongols were actually fleeing. Baybars planned to use their own medicine against them. The place he chose for the battle was no accident. Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, was a valley surrounded by wooded hills in southeastern Galilee. According to tradition, it was the place where young David had defeated the giant Goliath. The irony escaped no one. Once again, an apparent underdog would face a colossus that seemed invincible. The hills offered perfect cover for an ambush. The terrain was familiar to Baybars but unknown to the Mongols, and the valley was narrow enough to neutralize the tactical superiority of the steppe cavalry. In early September, Mamluk scouts located Kitbuka's army advancing southward. Qutuz ordered his men to hide in the hills surrounding the valley. Only Baybars's vanguard would remain visible, acting as bait. The night of September 2nd was long and silent. The Mamluk soldiers prayed toward Mecca, aware that dawn might be the last they would see. Some wrote letters to their families. Others sharpened their sabers until the metal gleamed like silver under the starlight. In his tent, Qutuz studied the maps one last time, reviewing every detail of the plan that could save Egypt or condemn it forever. On the other side of the valley, Kitbuka also prepared. His scouts had informed him of the enemy presence, but the numbers they reported did not concern him. He had seen far smaller Mongol forces destroy much larger armies. The discipline of his horse, archers, the speed of their maneuvers, the terror they inspired, all of that compensated for any numerical disadvantage. Besides, he had never lost a battle. No Mongol general of his generation had. That night, under a cloudless sky, the fate of the Muslim world hung by an invisible thread. September 3rd, 1260, dawned hot and dry. The sun rose over the hills of Galilee, bathing the valley of Ain Jalut in a golden light that would soon become something very different. Baybars was the first to move. With a relatively small contingent of cavalry, he descended into the valley and positioned himself so the Mongols could see him clearly. It was a deliberate provocation, designed to lure Kitbuka into the trap that Qutuz had prepared in the hills. It worked. Kitbuka saw the Mamluks and did not hesitate. He ordered his cavalry to charge, confident that Mongol speed and ferocity would crush this small contingent just as they had crushed so many others. His horse archers galloped forward, firing arrows as they advanced, a technique they had perfected over generations on the steppes of Central Asia. Baybars waited. He let the Mongols approach, let their arrows begin to find targets among his men, and then he gave the order to retreat. The Mamluks turned and fled deeper into the valley. To the Mongols, it looked like a repeat of 100 previous battles, the enemy panicking, breaking ranks, fleeing in terror. Kitbuka ordered the pursuit. His riders spurred their horses, hungry for blood, certain that victory was within reach. Pushing deeper and deeper into the valley, the Mongols did not notice the shadows moving on the hills on either side. They did not see the thousands of Mamluks posted among the trees, bows drawn and swords unsheathed. They did not feel the trap closing around them until it was too late. Kutus waited until the bulk of the Mongol army was completely inside the valley. And then he raised his saber. The Mamluk war cry resounded from all directions at once, from the hills to the east and west. From the north and south, thousands of warriors emerged from their hiding places. Arrows fell like black rain upon the Mongols. Heavy Mamluk cavalry charged from the flanks, their lances gleaming in the morning sun. For the first time in his life, Kitbuka found himself surrounded. But the Mongols were no ordinary warriors. Even surprised, even outnumbered, they fought with the ferocity that had made them legendary. Kitbuka rallied his men, formed a defensive circle, and counterattacked with desperate violence. For hours, the battle became a chaos of steel and blood. The Mamluks struck and withdrew. Their archers fired volley after volley from the heights. Their heavy cavalry charged again and again against the Mongol flanks. But the warriors of the steppes refused to break. At some point in the battle, the Mamluk line began to waver. The Mongols, sensing weakness, redoubled their efforts. For one terrible instant, it seemed that the tide was turning, that the invincibles would once again prove why the world feared them. It was then that Kutus did something no commander of his rank should do. He tore off his helmet, threw it to the ground, and galloped directly into the heart of the battle. "Wa Islama!" he shouted. "Oh my Islam!" His men saw him, helmetless, unprotected, charging against the Mongols like a man possessed. And something changed in them. Desperation transformed into fury. Fear became determination. The Mamluks rallied around their sultan and pushed forward with renewed ferocity. The battle lasted until noon. Slowly, relentlessly, the Mamluks gained ground. The Mongols began to retreat toward Baisan, a few miles to the north. They tried to regroup, launched a desperate counterattack, but the tide had already changed irrevocably. Kitbuka fought to the end. When his men fell around him, when it became clear that the battle was lost, his officers begged him to flee. He could still escape. He could still live to fight another day. He refused. "Death in battle is an honor," he reportedly replied. "Flight is a shame that pursues a man to the grave." He fought until his horse was cut down beneath him. He fought on foot, surrounded by enemies, until he was finally captured. They dragged him before Kutus, hands bound, armor shattered, blood running from a dozen wounds. But even then, even defeated and captive, Kitbuka did not bend. "Proud man," Kutus said to him, "you have shed so much innocent blood. You have destroyed dynasties with false promises. You have ended ancient empires, and now you have finally fallen into your own trap." Kitbuka raised his head and looked the Sultan in the eyes. "If I die by your hand," he replied, "I consider it to be God's will, not yours. Do not be deceived by this victory. When the news of my death reaches Hulagu Khan, the ocean of his wrath will boil over. From Azerbaijan to the gates of Egypt, the land will tremble beneath the hooves of Mongol horses. The leaves of the trees will wither from terror, and my sons will avenge my death." Qutuz did not respond. He ordered Kitbuka executed right there, on the battlefield where he had fallen. The veteran Mamluk Jamal al-Din Akush al-Shamsi carried out the sentence. The Mongol general's head was cut off and sent to Cairo, where it would be displayed on the city gates as proof of victory. The Mamluk chronicles, written by the victors, speak of Kitbuka with unusual respect. They describe him as a great warrior who preferred death to dishonor, a man of honor who fought to his last breath. He was an enemy, but he was a worthy enemy. When the sun set over Ain Jalut, the battlefield was covered with corpses. Mongols and Mamluks lay together in the bloodied earth, their differences erased by death. The survivors of the Mongol army had fled northward, pursued by Mamluk cavalry that would give them no quarter. For the first time in 43 years, since Genghis Khan began his conquest of the world, a Mongol army had been decisively defeated in pitched battle. And unlike all previous defeats, this time there would be no revenge. In the following weeks, Qutuz consolidated his victory. He reconquered Damascus, expelling the Mongols from Syria. He restored Mamluk dominion over the entire Levant region. Hulagu's dream of conquering Egypt had vanished forever, but Qutuz's victory would come at a bitter cost. On October 24th, 1260, barely 7 weeks after Ain Jalut, the sea, Sultan was riding back to Cairo when it happened. During a hunt, Baybars approached him and asked permission to keep a Mongol prisoner. Qutuz agreed. Baybars kissed his hand in gratitude. It was a prearranged signal. At that instant, a group of conspirators surrounded the Sultan. Baybars drew his sword and plunged it into Qutuz's neck. The man who had saved Egypt, who had stopped the Invincibles, died in the desert dust, betrayed by his own general. Baybars took the throne for himself. He would become one of the greatest sultans in Mamluk history, expanding the empire, defeating the Crusaders, repelling new Mongol incursions. But the shadow of his betrayal would never entirely leave him. The assassination of Qutuz is one of history's great ironies. The man who had demonstrated that the Mongols could be defeated died not at the hands of his enemies, but at the hands of his closest ally. Ambition, which had driven his own rise to power, claimed his life with the same coin. But his legacy endured far beyond his death. Ain Jalut changed the course of world history. It stopped Mongol expansion westward and preserved Egypt as the heart of the Islamic world for centuries. It demonstrated that the invincible conquerors were not invincible after all. It gave hope to all those who had lived under the shadow of Mongol terror. Hulagu, when he received news of the defeat, swore revenge. But he could never fulfill his oath. A civil war erupted between him and his cousin Berka Khan of the Golden Horde, who had embraced Islam and opposed the destruction of Baghdad. Hulagu spent his final years fighting other Mongols instead of conquering new lands. He died in 1265 without having avenged Kitbuka, the Mongol empire that had seemed destined to conquer. The entire world began to fragment. The 4 khanates that composed it turned against each other, too occupied with their internal disputes to coordinate new conquests. The era of Mongol expansion had ended. For the Muslim world, Ain Jalut was more than a military victory, it was a resurrection. After the fall of Baghdad, many had believed that Islam was doomed, that the Mongols would destroy everything the caliphs had built over 600 years. Ain Jalut proved that this was not so, that faith could survive empires, that the will of a few could change the destiny of millions. The Mamluk Sultanate would rule Egypt and Syria for more than 250 years, until the arrival of the Ottomans in 1517. During that time, the Mamluks would definitively expel the Crusaders from the Holy Land, repel multiple Mongol invasion attempts, and transform Cairo into one of the most important cultural centers of the medieval world. And it all began in a dusty valley of Galilee, where an army of slaves demonstrated that no empire is eternal, that no conqueror is invincible, that history is not written until it is written with blood and steel. Today, the site of the Battle of Ain Jalut is a quiet place. The fields where thousands of warriors fell are covered with grass. The spring that gave the place its name still flows, indifferent to the centuries that have passed. There are no grand monuments, no imposing memorials, only the wind blowing over the hills, carrying with it the echoes of that September morning when the world changed forever. But the legacy of Ain Jalut lives on in the memory of all those who remember that tyranny can be defeated, that resistance has meaning, that even giants can fall before those who refuse to kneel. Somewhere in the steppes of Central Asia, the descendants of the Mongol warriors still tell stories of their conquering ancestors. And in the mosques of Cairo, the faithful still remember Qutuz, the slave who became sultan, the man who stopped the invincibles, the hero who died, betrayed, but whose victory saved his people from annihilation. The spring of Goliath had seen another giant fall, and the world would never forget it.